Mason Webb woke before dawn, as always. The October cold seeped through the cracks of the log cabin he had built with his own hands 3 years ago, when he left the army and decided he would never return to civilization. Outside, among the pines of the Colorado Rockies, the fog still covered the valley like a gray blanket. He lit the wood-burning stove, brewed coffee that was too black and too strong, and sat in the rocking chair that creaked with every movement. The routine was always the same. Silence, solitude, exactly as he wanted it. Mason was 47, but he looked older. His face was marked by deep wrinkles, his graying beard poorly trimmed, his hands calloused from wielding an axe and saw every day. He had been a reconnaissance sergeant, a scout, someone trained to track, observe, and survive in any terrain. But what he learned most in the army was how to carry silences. Things he'd seen, things he'd done, orders he'd followed without question, things no one would ever know. At least, that's what he hoped. Every night, out of old habit, Mason turned on his military radio, a heavy olive-drab piece of equipment, the kind units used in the 80s. He would turn the dial slowly, scanning through empty frequencies, static, occasionally catching some chatter from truckers or ham radio operators. He never expected to hear anything. It was just a ritual, a way to fill the void before sleep. But in the early hours of that October morning, something changed. The radio emitted a different sound. It wasn't static. It was a pattern. Long beep, 2 short, pause. Short beep, 3 long. Morse code. Mason sat bolt upright in his chair, his muscles tense. He knew that rhythm. It wasn't just any code. It was a communication protocol used by military intelligence units, something he hadn't heard since the 80s. The frequency was supposedly dead, abandoned after the end of the Cold War. But there it was, crystal clear, cutting through the pre-dawn silence. Mason wrote down the sequence, translated it slowly. The message was simple, repetitive, geographic coordinates, a call sign, and one word that made his stomach clench: Blackthorn. He dropped the pencil. His hands were shaking. Blackthorn was the code name for an operation he had participated in back in 1987, somewhere in Central America, whose name he preferred not to remember. A mission that officially never happened. A mission the government denied. A mission Mason had been trying to forget every day for the last 38 years. He stayed awake the rest of the night, listening to the transmission repeat every 12 hours. Always at the same time, always the same message. By the time the sun rose over the snow-capped peaks, Mason had made a decision he knew would change everything. He needed to know who was transmitting, and why. But more than that, he needed to understand why someone would choose to resurrect a ghost that was supposed to be buried forever. Mason spent the next few days preparing his equipment. He had an old triangulation system he kept in boxes in the cellar, along with time-yellowed topographical maps, military compasses, and binoculars with scratched lenses, tools from a former life he had sworn never to use again. He set everything up on the kitchen table, calculating distances, checking angles, making notes in old notebooks. The transmission was coming from somewhere in the mountains of Wyoming, probably near the Montana border, a remote, sparsely populated region full of deep valleys and dense forests, perfect for someone who wanted to hide from the world and from himself. He knew he should let it go. His therapist, in the years when he still went to therapy, always said he needed to let go of the past, that reliving traumas didn't help anyone, that the only way to move forward was to build a new identity, far from the shadows of what he had been. But Mason couldn't. This message wasn't a coincidence. Someone knew about Blackthorn. Someone was calling out, and he had the unsettling feeling that the message was specifically for him, as if that ghost from the past knew exactly where he was. Mason threw a backpack onto the back seat of his faded red '92 Chevy, a truck with more than 300,000 kilometers on it and an engine that made strange noises on steep climbs. He padlocked the cabin, left a note for his nearest neighbor, 15 kilometers away, asking him to look after the place if he was gone longer than planned. And he left at dawn, while the frost still covered the dirt road. The road was empty and endless. Mason drove for hours, crossing valleys covered in fresh snow, passing through small towns that seemed frozen in time, places where nothing had changed in decades, gas stations with old pumps that still had mechanical dials, diners with flickering neon signs advertising apple pie and $1 coffee, roadside motels with perpetual vacancies and televisions that only got 3 channels. The The scenery was typical of the deep American West, where time seemed to have stopped in the 70s, and no one cared to change it. He stopped in Laramie, Wyoming to refuel and get something to eat. The attendant was an old man in a Broncos baseball cap and a faded plaid shirt, who looked at Mason with the kind of curiosity typical of people who live where strangers are rare. "Where are you headed, friend?" the old man asked, swiping the credit card through the ancient machine. "Just passing through," Mason replied curtly, avoiding eye contact. The old man smiled, showing a few missing teeth. "Yeah, I know the feeling. But be careful up in those mountains. There are strange folks out there. Had a guy, months back, asking about old radio towers. Seemed a bit lost, or maybe looking for something he didn't want to find." Mason felt a chill run up his spine. "Do you remember what he looked like? Tall, thin, long white beard. Must have been 60, maybe more. Sunken eyes, you know, like he hadn't slept in a long time. Stayed at a motel nearby, but disappeared after a few days. Nobody saw him again. Left the room too clean, you know, like a military man." Mason thanked him and drove on, his heart beating faster. Someone had been here before him. Someone else was searching, and by the sound of it, they knew how to hide well. The highway snaked through the mountains, growing narrower and more dangerous. Mason passed through small hamlets with forgotten names, places with a single church, a bar, and maybe a hardware store. Places where everyone knew everyone and strangers were noticed immediately. He avoided stopping, only refueling when necessary, eating sandwiches he bought at gas stations. He didn't want to leave a trail. He didn't want anyone to remember him. On the second night, he stopped at a cheap roadside motel, a place with thin walls and a broken neon sign that flickered irregularly. The manager was a young, bored man who barely looked at him as he handed over the key. Mason locked the door, propped a chair against the knob, and slept fully clothed with his revolver under the pillow. Old habits die hard. After 2 more days of meticulous searching, following the coordinates he had triangulated with military precision, Mason found the place. A clearing hidden among giant fir trees, accessible only by a nearly invisible trail that only someone with reconnaissance training could identify. In the center, an old radio tower, its rusted metal covered in moss with dangling cables swaying in the wind, and a small concrete shack beside it, its walls stained with dampness. The place looked like it had been abandoned for decades, but there were unmistakable signs of recent activity: footprints in the fresh snow, still warm ashes in a makeshift fire pit, and inside the shack, equipment powered on, lights blinking in the dark. Mason parked the pickup at a safe distance, covered it with branches and snow, and approached on foot, silently, using the cover of the trees. Every step was calculated, every sound analyzed. It was like going back in time, when he did this exact thing in the jungles of Central America, tracking targets, observing without being seen. He entered slowly, his hand steady on the .38 revolver he had carried on his belt since leaving the army. The room was small and stuffy, lit by a single yellowed bulb powered by a diesel generator that hummed monotonously outside. In the center, an old radio transmitter, a model he recognized immediately from the 80s, manually tuned, with red lights blinking at regular intervals. Beside it, a wooden chair with a worn seat, a tattered green wool blanket, cans of beans and soup stacked with military organization, and on the table, a black-covered notebook, worn by time and constant handling. Mason picked up the notebook carefully, as if it were a bomb about to explode. The pages were filled with handwritten notes in a small, precise script: dates, exact coordinates, full names and nicknames. And there, in the middle of it all, the word Blackthorn, underlined several times in red ink. He flipped through it slowly, his heart pounding in his chest. The notes described the operation in details only an insider could know. Names of soldiers he had known, exact dates of movements, descriptions of events that never appeared in official reports, and mistakes, things that went wrong, things deliberately covered up by superiors who now likely held important positions in Washington. There were hand-drawn maps, showing the village where it all happened. There was a list of civilian names, with ages, children, women, the elderly, all dead, all buried in mass graves that were never officially documented. Mason felt bile rise in his throat. He was there. He saw it all, and he did nothing to stop it. Mason sat in the chair, his legs weak, his breathing difficult. Whoever was here knew the whole truth, and they desperately wanted someone else to know it too. He returned to the tower every night, waiting, sleeping poorly in his pickup wrapped in musty-smelling blankets, waking at every sound from the forest. During the day, he explored the surrounding area, finding more evidence of someone's presence. A second fire pit hidden among rocks, empty cans carefully buried, footprints that led to a frozen stream and disappeared. Whoever was here was experienced, trained, cautious. On the fifth night, under a light snowfall that covered everything in white and muffled all sounds, Mason saw a figure approaching on the trail. A tall, very thin man, almost skeletal, with a heavy pack on his back and a hunting rifle slung over his shoulder. He moved slowly, constantly scanning the area, stopping to listen. Military training, unmistakable. He entered the shack without noticing Mason's presence, who was hidden behind the door with his revolver in hand, breath controlled, completely still. When the man lit the gas lantern, the two stared at each other in absolute silence. Mason recognized the face immediately, despite the deep wrinkles, the long, unkempt beard, the sunken, tired eyes. It was James Turner, JT, the radio operator from Mason's own unit in Blackthorn, a man listed as killed in action, missing since 1987, a man whose name was engraved on a memorial in Arlington, a man Mason was absolutely certain was dead. JT froze. The lantern trembled in his hand, casting dancing shadows on the concrete walls. His eyes widened, his mouth opened, but no sound came out. After a long silence heavy with memories and ghosts, he slowly lowered the rifle, as if his muscles had forgotten how. "Mason," he said, his voice hoarse and broken from days of not speaking to anyone. "I knew someone would hear it. I prayed someone would hear it. But I never thought it would be you." Mason stepped out of the shadows, his hands raised to show he was not a threat. He lowered the revolver and tucked it into his belt. "I thought you were dead, JT. Everyone did. There's a memorial with your name on it. Your family had a funeral." JT let out a bitter laugh that sounded more like a sob. "I thought I was going to die that day too. I should have, but I didn't. I ran like a coward. I let you all think I was dead because it was easier than explaining why I had to disappear." They sat facing each other in that cold shack, surrounded by old equipment and even older memories, and JT began to tell the story he had held inside for nearly 40 years. His voice was low, monotonous, as if he were reciting something he had repeated 1,000 times only to himself. He didn't die on that mission in 1987. He fled. Blackthorn wasn't what the official reports claimed. It wasn't a rescue operation for American hostages, as stated in the classified documents his family eventually received. It was a planned execution. Unarmed civilians, including women carrying babies and children playing in the street, were systematically killed. It wasn't crossfire. It wasn't a mistake. It was deliberate. JT was at the communications post when the orders came through. He heard everything over the radio. The coordinates, the clear instructions: eliminate all inhabitants of the village, plant weapons on the bodies, create evidence that they were enemy combatants, all coordinated from above, by people in clean offices in Washington who would never set foot in that jungle. He tried to question it. He was threatened. He said he would report it when he got back. He was told that if he tried, he would be charged with treason and spend the rest of his life in a military prison. So he did the only thing he could think of. He ran. He destroyed his equipment, burned his documents, and disappeared into the jungle. He survived for weeks eating what he could find, drinking from streams, avoiding patrols. He managed to reach the coast and stowed away on a cargo ship bound for the United States. He returned as a ghost, bought a fake ID from a guy he met in a bar in New Orleans. He worked on remote farms in the Midwest, in factories that didn't ask too many questions, on construction sites that paid in cash. He moved constantly, never staying in one place for more than 6 months. He never tried to contact his family. He knew it was better for them to go on thinking he was dead. But recently, about 6 months ago, he found out through an old contact, a veteran journalist who covered military affairs, that files from Operation Blackthorn were being declassified as part of a historical review of Cold War operations, and they were being actively manipulated. The truth was being rewritten by people who weren't there, who didn't see the blood, who didn't hear the screams, who had an interest in protecting reputations and careers. Some of the officers who gave the orders that day now held important positions in the government, the private sector, on the boards of defense companies. JT decided he couldn't let it happen without at least trying to do something. He used all his life savings to buy old radio equipment from military surplus stores and auction sites. He traveled to this abandoned tower that he remembered from the communications maps of the era. He set it all up himself, tuned the frequencies, and started broadcasting. The message was simple, a code that only people from the operation would recognize, and the impossible hope that someone was still listening, someone who remembered, someone who carried the same weight, someone who could bear witness with him. Mason listened in absolute silence, the crushing weight of guilt pressing on his chest like a giant stone. He too carried Blackthorn every day. He too had tried to forget in every way possible. Therapy that didn't work because he couldn't be honest about what really happened. Medications that left him numb but didn't erase the memories. Alcohol that only made everything worse, that had him waking up in gutters, in police cells, in hospitals, and finally, total isolation in the mountains, far from everyone and everything, where at least he didn't have to pretend he was okay. But it never really worked. The faces always came back in his dreams, especially a little girl, no older than 7, with a floral dress and braids in her hair. She was standing in the doorway of a house when it all started. Mason saw her fall, saw the blood, and he did nothing, just stood there, following orders, completing the mission. The voices always echoed in the silence of his cabin. Please in Spanish he didn't understand but didn't need to. The meaning was universal. Please, no, mercy. And now JT was here, older, thinner, more broken, but still trying, still fighting in some way, asking for help, asking Mason to do the one thing he had been avoiding for almost 40 years, to speak, to testify, to break the silence that protected not only him, but an entire chain of command that went all the way up to the highest echelons of power. I don't know if I can do this, JT, Mason finally said, his voice low and hesitant. I've spent years trying to leave this behind. I built a whole life around forgetting. If I talk, it all falls apart. They'll investigate me. They'll arrest me, maybe. At the very least, they'll destroy whatever credibility I have left. JT looked at him with eyes that had seen too much, lived through too many horrors. And what kind of life is that, Mason? You live alone on a mountain. You don't talk to anyone. You don't sleep right. You have no family, no friends. I know because I did the same thing for 38 years. The difference is, I finally understood that forgetting doesn't work. The guilt doesn't go away. It just gets heavier with each passing year, until you can't carry it anymore. And what if we talk and nothing changes? What if it only destroys the little we still have? What if no one believes us, or worse, what if they believe us but don't care? JT leaned forward, his eyes gleaming in the faint light of the lantern. Then at least we die knowing we tried, that we didn't let the lie win without a fight, that we weren't accomplices to the very end. Those people in that village deserve to have someone say their names. They deserve for someone to admit what was done, even if it's too late, even if it changes nothing. Mason stayed awake all night, sitting in that cold shack, listening to the wind howl through the pines like the voices of ghosts. He thought about everything he had lost over the years. His marriage to Sarah, which didn't last 5 years because he couldn't be emotionally present. Always mentally trapped in that jungle, always reliving that day. She tried to help, she really did, but eventually she gave up, because loving someone who is constantly absent is impossible. The friends from his army days who drifted away because he became distant, closed off, impossible to reach. The reunions he stopped attending, the phone calls he stopped returning, until they stopped trying. The daughter he barely knows, Emily. She must be 23 now, lives somewhere in California, works in something related to tech. He knows because she still sends Christmas cards, despite everything. Cheerful cards with pictures of her smiling that Mason puts on the refrigerator and looks at every day with a tightness in his chest. She writes short messages. Dad, I hope you're doing well. I think about you. It would be nice to talk sometime. And he never responds properly, just sends back a generic card with a signature. Because he doesn't know what to say. Because he's afraid she'll ask about his life and he'll have to lie. Or worse, tell the truth. The peace he could never find anywhere. Not even in the most remote mountains in the world. He built that cabin thinking physical distance would solve it. That getting away from civilization would get him away from the memories. But they traveled with him. They were there every night, in every shadow, in every silence. And he realized something fundamental in those cold early hours, sitting next to a ghost from the past who turned out to be alive and still bleeding from the same wounds. The silence wasn't protection. The silence was the prison. It wasn't what he did in Blackthorn that was destroying him every day. It was what he never had the courage to say. The truth caught in his throat for 40 years, poisoning everything. Poisoning his marriage, his friendships, his relationship with his daughter. Poisoning even the air he breathed in the mountains that were supposed to be pure. The next morning, as the sun rose, painting the snow gold through the fir branches, Mason made his decision. He looked at JT, who had fallen asleep sitting in the chair, exhausted, and said simply, "Let's do it. Let's tell them everything." They spent the entire day preparing. JT had saved documents, copies of orders he had managed to keep, photographs he had taken in secret, names of other soldiers from the unit who might still be alive, the exact coordinates of the village, all organized over years of solitary investigation. Mason contributed his own detailed memory. As a scout, he was trained to observe and remember. He remembered the faces of officers who gave orders. He remembered conversations he had overheard. He remembered details that could be verified. Together, they prepared a final broadcast, not in Morse code that no one could decipher anymore, in a clear voice in plain English, in words anyone could understand. They recorded detailed testimonies on old cassette tapes that JT had bought specifically for this purpose. They cited the full names of superior officers, including some who were now retired generals, consultants for defense companies, even politicians. They gave exact dates, precise geographic coordinates that anyone could check. They described in painful detail what really happened in Blackthorn, how many people died, how they died, why they died, who gave the orders, who carried them out, who covered it up, and why. Always why. Because someone decided those lives didn't matter, that they were expendable in the name of strategic objectives that probably didn't even make sense. They made copies, lots of copies. They used JT's entire stock of tapes. They addressed envelopes to investigative journalists at major newspapers, to veterans of other units known for exposing military abuses, to human rights organizations, to specific members of congressional committees with a history of investigating classified operations. And they began to transmit, first on open amateur radio frequencies, where anyone listening could record, then on military frequencies, even knowing it would attract immediate attention. The message was always the same, simple, direct, impossible to misinterpret. My name is James Turner. I was a radio operator in Operation Blackthorn in 1987. I am alive, and I need to tell you what really happened. My name is Mason Webb. I was a scout sergeant in the same operation. I was there, and I saw everything, and then they would start talking, taking turns, telling the whole story, omitting nothing, softening nothing, the naked, raw, bloody truth. They broadcast for 6 hours straight. Then they left the shack and drove to the nearest town. They found a post office. They mailed all the envelopes. They went back and broadcast again. 6 hours after the first transmission, when it was night again, they heard the sound. Helicopters. Multiple. Approaching fast. Searchlights cutting through the forest darkness. JT looked at Mason and smiled. A genuine smile, the first in decades, probably. Time to go. They shut down the equipment. They took only the essentials, 2 backpacks that were already prepared, and they left from opposite sides of the clearing, using different trails they had mapped out in the preceding days. Mason went north. JT went south. No long goodbyes, just a nod. A silent understanding between men who had finally done what had to be done. Mason walked through the dark forest for hours. He could hear the helicopters behind him, voices on bullhorns ordering him to surrender. But he knew these mountains. He knew how to move without being seen. He reached where he had left the pickup hidden. The blanket of snow was undisturbed. They hadn't found it yet. He got in, started the engine, and drove without headlights down the narrow trail until he reached a secondary road. He drove all night. He crossed back into Colorado on roads that didn't appear on any GPS. He arrived at his cabin 3 days later, exhausted, hungry, but strangely at peace. 3 months passed. It was a harsh winter. The snow piled up meters high. Mason was isolated in the cabin for weeks. No news. Oh, not knowing if anyone had listened, if anyone had cared, if anything had changed. Then the stories started to appear. First on small websites, investigative journalism blogs. Then in major newspapers. A reporter from the Washington Post picked up the story. Then another from the New York Times. Veterans began to speak out, confirming parts of the story. Documents were leaked by anonymous sources inside the Pentagon. Investigations were officially opened by congressional committees. Hearings were scheduled. Retired officers were summoned to testify. Some denied everything. Others admitted parts. One or two had nervous breakdowns during the televised depositions, but the system was slow, bureaucratic. It protected its own. Lawyers were hired. Lawsuits were filed. Counter-narratives were planted. Witnesses were discredited. Mason was visited by federal agents twice. Long interrogations. Veiled threats of prosecution for revealing classified information. But he had nothing left to lose. He repeated everything he had said in the broadcasts. He signed official statements. He said he was willing to testify under oath. The agents left without arresting him, probably because arresting a veteran who was exposing war crimes would be too politically complicated, especially with the media paying attention. He never saw JT again. But 3 weeks after the investigations began, Mason received a postcard. No return address. A smudged postmark from somewhere in Oregon. The picture showed snow-covered mountains under an impossibly blue sky. On the back, a sentence written by hand in a shaky but legible script. "Thanks for listening. Thanks for speaking. Now I can rest." And below it, just the initials, JT. Mason put the postcard on the cabin wall, next to the window overlooking the valley, tacked up with a rusty nail. He looked at it every day. That night he turned on the military radio one last time. He turned the dials slowly, passed through the familiar frequencies, listened to the familiar static, the distant voices of truckers talking about icy roads and ham radio operators discussing antennas. And then, for the first time in decades, Mason turned the radio off completely. He disconnected the cables. He stored the equipment in a box in the cellar, covered it with an old blanket. He no longer needed to listen for ghost voices in the pre-dawn hours. He no longer needed to search for signals from a past that haunted him. He had said what needed to be said. He had done what needed to be done. And that, finally, after so long, was enough. The silence that followed was different from all the previous silences Mason had known. It wasn't oppressive, heavy, suffocating like the silence of the nights after Blackthorn. It wasn't empty and desperate like the silence of his years of isolation. It wasn't laden with guilt and regret like lead in his chest. It was true peace. Imperfect, fragile, but real, tangible. For the first time in 38 years, Mason could take a deep breath without feeling that tightness in his chest, without feeling like he was carrying the weight of all those lives on his back. He hadn't saved the world. He hadn't achieved complete justice. Some of those responsible would never face real consequences. The system was too big, too powerful, too protected. But some were exposed. Some truths were revealed. Some families finally learned what happened to their loved ones in that village in 1987. It wasn't perfect justice, but it was something. It was acknowledgement. It was a testimony. It was the truth existing somewhere beyond the oppressive silence that had held it captive for 4 decades. And Mason had done his part. He had spoken when it would have been easier to remain silent. He had chosen truth when the lie was safer. He had chosen responsibility when denial was more comfortable. 3 weeks later, Mason did something he hadn't done in years. He took a pen and paper and wrote a letter to his daughter. A long, honest letter, explaining where he had been emotionally all those years. Not giving the details of Blackthorn, but explaining that he had carried the guilt of things he did in the army, that he had finally found a way to deal with it, that he was sorry for being an absent father, that he would understand if she wanted no more contact, but that if she was willing, he would like to really get to know her, to listen to her, to be present in a way he never could be before. He mailed the letter without much hope, but 2 weeks later, he received a reply. Emily had written back. She said she had always known something was weighing on him, that she, too, had carried his absence in ways she was only now, as an adult, able to understand. But she was willing to try, to talk, to build something, even starting from scratch, even if it was hard, because he was her father, and because it's never too late for truth and new beginnings. Mason read that letter 5 times. Then he placed it next to JT's postcard on the wall. 2 pieces of paper that represented bridges, connections, possibilities. That night, sitting on the cabin porch with a cup of warm coffee, watching the snow fall softly on the pines, Mason Webb finally achieved something that had seemed impossible. He slept through the entire night without waking up in a cold sweat, without nightmares of a distant jungle, without seeing the faces of people who had died almost 40 years ago. For the first time in decades, he slept in peace. And when he woke the next morning to the sun rising over the mountains, He realized he could imagine a future, not a grand or dramatic future, but a real one. Maybe a visit from his daughter in the spring, maybe difficult but honest conversations, maybe, eventually, some form of forgiveness, from himself, from others, maybe not. But the possibility existed now, and that was more than he'd had in a very long time.